My name is Federico Bonacossa. I'm a composer and a guitarist based in Miami, and I'm happy to represent Italy and Sardinia as part of Italy in the Unity and Diversity project. So interestingly enough, composing didn't come into play until quite a bit later. I was always very much interested in the idea of writing music, but mostly at first I was doing a lot of arranging of popular songs, transcriptions, that sort of thing. I definitely did quite a bit of that and I really very much enjoyed it. So I would take, say, a solo guitar piece, make a version for flute and guitar, or maybe a piano piece and arrange it for guitar, that sort of thing. That arranging was always very, very much something that interests me. But also composition became kind of an interest more or less through my connections with composition students. And at the conservatory, I was very close friends with several composition students. So I was very interested in the kind of training that they were getting. And I was also friends with some of the composition faculty this was back at the conservatory in Cagliari in Sardinia. And so I did make a few attempts to start studying composition more or less formally. Now, the composition formal training in Italy was very rigorous, and it basically required you to do quite a few years of counterpoint, for example, so I kind of got started on that, but I never really had an opportunity to truly pursue it consistently until much later. And then it wasn't until I moved to Baltimore. So I kept doing arranging and a little bit of writing here and there, but it wasn't really until I moved to Baltimore that suddenly I had this incredible urge to start writing music that came almost out of nowhere. And I would say probably had been several years since I had written anything up until that point. And then all of a sudden it just became an obsession. And so from that point on, I did a lot of studying on my own, a lot of writing. I also managed to take composition lessons throughout my graduate studies of guitar. I was always finding an excuse to take some private composition lessons, as well as taking classes that were kind of related to composition, like counterpoint, for example. And I also did a lot of studying on my own. I would go to the library, read scores and study composition, not so much composition books, but counterpoint books, for example, that sort of thing. So that's an interesting question because although I grew up in Italy and in Sardinia, and I spent, actually I just realized today that I have spent right now half of my life here and half of my life in Sardinia. So I was there for quite a number of years. I didn't move away until I was in my early 20s. So although I was very much kind of brought up in that culture, I also at the same time grew up in a bilingual household because my mother is American. So she was born and raised in the United States and then moved to Italy through a series of events, and we wound up in Sardinia. So I always had a little bit of a foot outside of Sardinia in that sense, kind of like culturally, if you will. So I wasn't so much absorbing the culture the way that one would have if the way that one would if they were brought up, say, in a small village in the central part of Sardinia where they really speak dialect and hear folk music. So in the town where I grew up, which is called Olbia, and it's a northeastern part of Sardinia, it's very much a port city and it has influences from all over the place. There isn't really a local dialect, for example, which is unusual for Sardinia because there's so many different kinds of people that move there. Mostly locals from Sardinia, but also from other regions. And so as a result, you don't have kind of a local folk music, for example, but you hear it, it's in the air, you always hear it on on TV. You see kind of traveling groups passing by. There's always festivals. There's a lot of musicians that have influences, very strong, even local musicians that whose music is very, very much influenced by Sardinian music. And so, although personally I never had kind of a deep knowledge of it or anything, it definitely is a part of me. And interestingly enough, although I mentioned before that I didn't do a lot of composing before I got to Baltimore, which was in the early 2000s, there was one time when I first moved to the United States that I had this urge. This was prior to my kind of bigger urge that has not that has still continued till now. But there was kind of a bout of kind of compositional drive that came up when I first moved to the United States, and what the music that came out was actually very much Sardinian, inspired by Sardinian folk music. And I remember it surprising me, because I thought, wow, that's interesting. I don't really listen to Sardinian music, but somehow I know, I hear it, I feel it. I felt the chord progressions, that kind of the language was sort of, and that's when I realized that, sometimes the things that influence you or make an appearance when you least expect them. Well, yes, definitely. Now, when I go back to Sardinia, there are certain things that I certainly miss. I, of course, miss my friends, but there are certain elements of the culture that are really strong in Sardinia, and unlike anywhere else I've seen. For example, this incredible pride in showing that you value someone's friendship. Let's say in personal connection over money, for example. I know people that don't make a lot of money who will absolutely go out of their way to pay for the bill at a restaurant, even though maybe they can't afford it, or if they can, it's a sacrifice for them to do so. But yet they will wrestle you to the ground before they let you pay, and I think that's really indicative of a very kind of local pride. That's part of it too, but also just this idea that yes, money is important, but not that important, not as important as people, not as important as friendship, and I think that's quite powerful. So it's in some ways less materialistic as a culture. Of course, that depends on the person. It's not. There are lots of people that I know here that are not materialistic either. So. But that part there, for instance, if you go get a coffee with somebody and you pay for their coffee, and then a month later you run into them, they will remember that you paid for their coffee, and they will never let you pay. They will that's a very common thing. And again, it's a very cultural thing that's a little hard to understand. In fact, sometimes when it happens here, I sometimes appear to be a little bit forceful if I'm trying to get a beer with a friend and I say, no, I'm paying. They go, okay. But it's that kind of it's a way of showing that you appreciate somebody and that you care about them, and that the fact that you're having to pay money doesn't really matter. It's not a kind of showing off that you can afford it. It's a little hard to explain. So anyway, that is definitely one part that I appreciate. I certainly appreciate the music, the intricacies of the local music. There's quite a bit of different things that are happening. There's definitely an interest in maintaining a tradition that's very, very, very strong, and it varies depending on the region. And I must say, I never really got to fully travel around Sardinia the way that I would like to do someday, to truly kind of explore the different genres and different instruments. And there's a lot of really fascinating instruments. Just today, actually, I was writing a composition for a dance company, and I had this idea. It's actually not coincidentally related to Italy as a whole, but one of the pieces, at least that I want to do, will be a tribute to Sardinia. And one of the sounds that came out in this composition that I was writing was the sound of the launeddas, which is a reed instrument that has a very, very specific kind of sound and very specific kind of licks and gestures that they do. And so that showed up in my composition. But again, I feel like an outsider. I have absorbed these. I know that the sounds are definitely in me and in my mind, but I definitely feel like quite a bit of an outsider still when it comes to Sardinian music. So No Potho Reposare is one of those songs that if you grew up in Sardinia, you just inevitably will be familiar with. And there were some very well-known renditions by basically any Sardinian singer will have engaged with that song. It's an interesting song because it's quite simple, and yet it's quite profound, and it has a kind of a sadness to it that I think is quite part of the culture itself, a sort of like a longing, a sense of longing, a sense of like things can be rough sometimes. I mean, I think Sardinians definitely know what it's like to go through tough times. I mean, just a generation or two ago, I mean, they've seen lots of, they've seen famine, they've seen malaria, they've seen, I mean, obviously those are not that recent, and they're not current problems, but the point is, I grew up with people, my grandmother, who died just not that many years ago. She went through the war and she had malaria, and, there's like, they knew what it was like to have serious problems. I knew people who, I had uncles who, when they were kids, they had no shoes because there were no shoes available during the war. I mean, that kind of a thing. So, in other words, it's definitely kind of, it's part of, it speaks to a certain kind of collective feeling of a kind of a memory of tough times, let's say. The other thing about that tune is that it's one of those tunes it's one of those tunes that if you listen to a couple of times, you will pretty much never forget it. And the interesting thing with that song is that it came to me, I had really not thought of it in many years. And then suddenly, and I want to say what happened was, there was the COVID outbreak, and there were these images of people in Italy really truly suffering. And I also was communicating, of course, with my family and friends, and all were saying, they were stuck at home, and that the regulations were very, very strict during COVID there. And so it was just this incredible suffering that we were witnessing from the outside. This was before things got much tougher for us, and they really were tougher there than they were here in some respects. And I just had this kind of feeling of sadness and compassion towards my compatriots, the people from my island, and this tune started to haunt me. And so I just had to, I started kind of playing it on the guitar, and I remembered that I used to play it. Somehow I remembered more or less the chords. I mean, it's only got 3 or 4 chords, and I remember the tune, and I sort of like relearned it by ear because I've never even seen the sheet music for the song. I don't think officially there is one. And so I just made a little video and I posted it on Facebook, and I said, okay, this is a little tribute to my Sardinian friends. And then in those days, people really, really needed this kind of stuff. And they, and I remember it getting a lot more, let's just say it wasn't viral or anything, but it got a lot more views than my regular guitar videos, which don't get that many. So I remembered it was just this huge, very, very powerful reaction. And so that tune, I knew that I had to come back to it at some point. I knew that I was going to have to come to terms with it. And so that's kind of what happened, then a few years later, I came back to the tune again, and that very, very simple arrangement I had made never really satisfied me. And so I came back to it, and actually it was one summer that I was visiting Italy. I started to play the tune again, and I started to imagine a sort of introduction to the tune that was related to the melody, but as a kind of counterpoint to it. And so that then triggered all these other kind of the idea basically of having more or less a contrapuntal line running through the entire piece. And then also, of course, I was interested in really making it my own, so I reharmonized the tune considerably. I mean, like I said, the original tune only has a couple of chords, so I really wanted to dig deep and see what I could get out of it and make it really personal. So it's without basically touching the melody, letting the melody be what it was, but trying to put as much as I could of my own in it. So yes, I picked the key of D, which was actually the original key that I used to play it in. I kept it in that key because it actually is a very good key for this tune, because the melody sits kind of right in the middle of the register, and I was able to bring it, basically introduce the melody in a kind of middle octave, and then also have it play an octave lower later. It's kind of a bass line, and then also one octave higher. And then also the reason D major works really, really well is because there's a lot of harmonics, natural harmonics that are available. So aside from moving the melody to different octaves, which then allow me to do different things in terms of the reharmonization and voicings that I used, it also lends itself to being played entirely with harmonics, with natural harmonics, which is really, really nice. And then again, because of the various places in which you can put the melody, you can then experiment with lots of different fingerings. I very much like the effect of having basically different fragments of a scale or of a melody that moves by step on different strings, so that you get a kind of resonance, almost like a natural reverb. And you can let notes overlap in duration, and you can choose whether you want to do that more or less. Lots of open strings as well. And at the same time, I really like voicings that have notes that are very, very close together. Like, for example, I don't know, an E minor 7 that has a D and an F sharp and a G. So a D on the third string, F sharp on the second string, and G on the first string, so that the voicing has kind of a bite to it. So that very much interests me. But I think all in all, really the most interesting thing to me was this idea of counterpoint. Because really it's not a typical arrangement of just like a melody with some chords underneath. The middle, let's say the secondary voice is really running through all the time, with some parts that are more kind of one chord at a time, but most of the time it's really very much running through the entire composition, and that was very much interesting to me. I guess I am a very much love composing contrapuntally when I have the possibility, and this is definitely no exception to it. So I would say it's matured in the sense that I feel like, especially lately, no longer have the urge to make something sound modern or dissonant just for the sake of it being modern and dissonant. I don't really care that much. At this point in time, I've written music, with electronics, and music for electronics, music for feedback, music for, tonal music for different instruments, chamber music. So I've written a lot of different things. So I suppose I don't have the sense that to me, it's basically, they're all possibilities. And especially if you're, it really depends on the situation. So if I'm writing music just for me, if it's not something I'm writing for someone else, then I try to let my imagination run wild and let it take me where it wants to take me. And that sometimes is very surprising. I mean, there are situations where I'll set off to compose a piece for one thing or one kind of piece, and then it just doesn't work. And then suddenly this other piece emerges out of like a little idea, and then it turns into a whole different piece, and that's fine. Now, when it's music that is written for someone else, music or somebody's paying for, let's say, that's a little bit different. Then I really try, especially now, to see if I can write something that is useful to them. For instance, I work a fair amount with dance, with dance groups, and that's a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing that. I really love seeing the pieces come to life, but they have very specific needs and sometimes a very specific kind of thematic that they're going after. So for me to come in and do something that is totally useless to them is kind of, I mean, why accept the commission if you're going to do that? So my point is, I very much enjoy the craft of composing, and I don't think that the type of music itself is necessarily that important, as long as it's genuine and honest, and you feel good about it. But I think some of the composers I admire the most are able to take any kind of piece, any kind of composition, whether it's an arrangement of a folk song or a very complex orchestral piece, and still, through their craft, make something really good out of it. I'm sometimes really surprised. One composer that comes to mind, actually, fortunately, recently died. Her name is Sofia Gubodulina. She was really a master at this, taking an idea that initially you might listen to and go, man, is that even that interesting of an idea? And then 20 minutes later, that idea has become this enormous it's this enormous composition that is just going, like, she really was able to take an idea and make something out of it. And that's craft. Beethoven was a master at that, many other composers. So that the craft interests me very, very much. And I'm sometimes really intrigued by the idea of just taking whatever idea and see what I can do with it. Well, I guess the simplest thing is to keep the melody intact, because most people will recognize the melody well before they would be able to identify the chords, let's say. Not to mention, this song has been played by so many people, I think it would be hard to even figure out what the original chords are unless you find the composer's original manuscript, let's say. So the way that I usually go about it is if I arrange a folk song, is I take the folk song and I try to reduce it. So whether or not the original had 7 chords or 3 or 2, I try to reduce it to the simplest possible version. So basically I create a version that has the melody the way that it is, but I harmonize it in the simplest possible way, which typically in a song like this will be using 1s and 5s and 4s, let's say. But I try to keep it simple like that. And this reminds me, years ago, I was playing with a guy in my hometown that played guitar by ear. So he could play a whole bunch of different chords, but he had always only played by ear. And I remember I wanted to play a Brazilian song with him that had fairly complex chords, but not that complex, but it had like a key change, And he didn't know the names of the chords. So I was trying to explain to him the names of these songs. I would say, okay, like E half diminished, and he would say, I don't know what that is. So he said, you know what, just play, and I will figure out with the chords that I know which chord fits. And lo and behold, he would play a chord that actually matched the function, and it was not the same exact chord, but it worked. And so that taught me that that sometimes you can. This is also very much true in jazz standards. Like, one of the reasons I enjoy studying jazz standards is that you learn a lot about which chords are really the structural ones and which ones are kind of auxiliary. And in turn, you then learn how to take a chord progression that is simple and make it more complex. So, but for that to happen, you think you need to have an understanding of what the very, very foundational elements of the melody and harmony are, so that you can take it in different directions. And so that's what I did with that song. For example, I took it and I simplified it so that I could play it only with 3 chords. And then once I had it really, really, really clear, then I started to add chords in between and reharmonizing and all of that kind of stuff. So that's how I kept it true, I think, is by bringing it to the very foundational elements of the song. Basically the part, the most, and even the melody, you can simplify it in such a way that you only have the characteristic notes, the ones that are really, truly memorable, and that give the melody the identity that it has. Yes, I do a lot of collaborations. This collaboration with Sam Desmet is a great example of what happens when 2 or more people come together to conceive a project. I think it's wonderful, and it really is kind of I can't think of a better example of a project that brings together different kinds of artists doing very different kinds of things from different kinds of backgrounds into a single unified project. I think that's remarkable also to get it done with so many different moving parts. But as far as I'm concerned, I have been very, very lucky that maybe 15 years ago, I met a choreographer named Diego Salterini, who's an Italian choreographer, and he has a dance company called Dance on Miami that he co-founded with Hannah Baumgarten, who was another Miami-based dancer choreographer, and they commissioned me to write a piece back then. They were already kind of pretty successful. They were doing shows locally, but since then they've really, really gone fairly far. They've done all kinds of international tours, all kinds of things. But in those days, they were still in kind of fairly early stages. And so they commissioned me to write a piece, and we just had a great time working together. And they've kept commissioning pieces at least every other year, but more often than not, it's every year. So we've done just about a project a year, every year or 2 since then. And I've done tons of different things for them, electronic music for microtonal music, and music for chamber music, or electronics, synthesizers. I mean, all kinds of things. And they're always open to my ideas. And then another dancer that I've collaborated with quite a bit is a Cuban-American dancer, Lázaro Godoy, who now lives in Spain. And the last project we worked on was as an autobiographical work called Brookdale. And it was a great experience, and he brought it around Europe, different venues. And, but whenever I can, I do like to perform contemporary music when I can. So I collaborate that way with composers that write music either for me or that I happen to be able to play either through the ensemble that I co-founded, the Last 100 Ensemble, or through New Music Miami, for example, a festival in which I take part very often. So yeah, I mean, I think music in many ways requires, certainly if you're a composer, it's very tough to be living in isolation all the time. It depends on kind of music that you write, but even collaboration with other composers, recently I did a collaboration with an organization called Mud Foundation that promotes music and art that merges technology, that utilizes technology in various creative ways, and so that's been really fun as well. So yeah, anytime I can, I definitely enjoy collaborating. Well, I can definitely say there were some artists that were very influential when I was growing up. I haven't, quite honestly, kept up with the music scene in Sardinia that much. So I'm sure there's lots of great young artists right now. But when I was growing up, there was a festival in my hometown that was run by a fellow named Gesuino Deiana, and he had a band called Cordas et Canas that was essentially I suppose you could call it a kind of rock band of sorts, but they probably wouldn't, they'd be happy if I called it a rock band. So maybe rock band is not the right term, but it's basically a band with drums and guitar and things like that. But they had very much a connection with Sardinian music. But then they also ran this festival where they invited artists from all over the world that had a connection with ethnic music of different kinds. And so we got to see all these incredible artists that would come in playing guitars with like strange tunings or instruments you've never seen before. There were people from Cuba, people from Eastern Europe, and it was just so fascinating, really, really, really fascinating. I remember there was an accordion player named Antonello Salis that was just a really wild improviser. And you know, me as a teenager, just watching these musicians play, it just blew my mind always. So that was pretty great. There's also a great guitar player from my town in Olbia named Marino de Rosas. He was a very good friend of mine, and he specialized in playing with open tunings, kind of like a lot of American folk music. And I think that's kind of where he got the idea of doing open tunings. And but also added his own twist to it, very much influenced by Sardinian music, that a lot of kind of more modern renditions of Sardinian traditional songs, as well as his own compositions. And who else can I think of? As far as our sculptors go, there was a sculptor that I actually had, I never met in person, but I saw his work being used as an instrument at a jazz festival that's called Time in Jazz, that probably still runs and ran every year when I was a kid. It was organized by Paolo Fresu, a trumpet player, jazz musician from Sardinia, from a town called Berchidda. And I actually had a guitar teacher from that town, so I would go to that festival almost every year. And there too, it was a huge mix of artists from all over the place. And one year they had these sculptures that were by Pinuccio Sciola, that were very abstract but very fascinating, and they could be used with, you know, if you had the right tool, you could actually make sound with them. And there are actually a couple of those in a town that's very, very close to my hometown called Golfaranci. And so I remember, that concert many, many, many years ago. But then not that many years ago, I went to this town called Golfaranci. My dad has a boat, so we sailed there. And I got out of the boat and I saw two of these sculptures, and I said, "Wow, that's amazing!" I remember those sculptures. So that definitely left an impact on me. And the sculptures, the work I've seen of Pinuccio Sciola is always very impressive to me. There definitely has a very specific kind of voice, if for lack of a better word. But all the artists I mentioned, they're all great artists. But as far as visual artists, I wish I knew more actually. But Pinuccio Sciola is definitely one that I would recommend checking out. Yes, so I have a few things cooking right now. The biggest project I'm working on at the moment is a commission by Dance Now Miami that I was talking about, and it's going to be a piece entirely dedicated to Italian culture, and in fact, there's going to be a little bit of a Sardinian segment to it, but it's going to be the format will be a chamber composition, and it will be performed in early May at the Aventura Cultural Arts Center, as well as the Broward Center for the Performing Arts to start. And then I think it'll be taken on tour. So we'll see where that goes, but we're still kind of in the very early stages of it. So to anything related to Dance Time Miami, you can just Google their name and you'll find their website. I have a website called anirongatemelts.net. It's a funny story how that name came about, but the long story short is that I had a website called federicobonacossa.com, and I forgot to pay the domain name one year after many, many, many years, and I lost it. It was bought by some, who knows, some web AI tool that steals web names and then sells them for ridiculous prices. So I never bought it back. And but all my that website has all of my compositions. Well, not all, but majority of my compositions. Most of them have with scores too, etc. So it's all there. And as far as other projects, so I'm actually in the one of the things I'm going to do that's an interesting thing is a collaboration with an 18th century guitarist, and I'm going to write a piece for him that's kind of in the style of Giuliani and Soar, those kinds of things. It's an interesting experiment, but it should be fun. And so we're going to work on that. His name is Marco Battaglia. He's from Milan. And then from there, this will be kind of a game that we're doing, kind of writing a piece in a style, using a theme that he proposed. So I'm going to write something to see what happens. I do, as a hobby, often write music in old styles. I have several compositions. I have some pieces for viola da gamba. I have some pieces for lute that are supposed to be, at least in my imagination, in the style. There's a tradition in classical music of this kind of stile antico, composing in old style. So that's fun. And then I'm also going to be working on a lot more substantial guitar composition for a friend. And there's probably some other things I'm forgetting, but that's all that comes to my mind right now. So yes, but all of that information, I think a good way to follow anything that I do is on Facebook, actually. I do post. When I do post, I post on Facebook.